Grow your practice, grow your wealth, grow your impact. Find out how to spend less time in the dental chair and more time on the things you love.
Welcome back to the Dental Wealth Podcast. Today, I want you to put your thinking hats on really quick. And it's really about thinking bigger. I started having this conversation with a client recently, and we were talking about the amount of money to allocate towards savings and putting aside. And, I truly believe in America, we have an epidemic of underperformance. And I really mean that. I would write that down. We have an epidemic of underperformance. The idea of most financial advisors have this idea of 90-10 rule, which basically states that 10% of your total income would go then to some type of an investment account. So 10% goes to an investment account, some type of a savings and accumulation, and you get to below 90%. And by the way, this isn't a new principle. Even, you can go back and even if you read The Richest Man in Babylon, this idea of just taking 10% of your money and putting it aside, and then you live off 90%. But I find a lot of flaws with that. And I find a lot of flaws with that idea. Now, whether you believe in tithing or not, I will tell you that if you're putting 10% towards savings, I'm not surely where tithing comes in there. But that's a conversation for another day. But I want you to think about this for a second. So is that enough? If you take home $100,000, should only $10,000 be going into savings and investment? And I would argue that it's not. It's not enough to get where you want to go. And I would argue, and I believe in the 70-30 rule, but I want to walk you through the 70-30 rule really quick. And I've talked about it a little bit before in this podcast, but I want to kind of come back to it because sometimes these things become overwhelming, and you start, when I mean overwhelming is that you think about them and you see, gosh, if I could get people to really understand that it's really about more of a advanced type strategy, and you got to think through this. So first of all, the 70-30 rule looks like this. 70% goes into your take home, and you can do whatever you want with that. And so 70% goes to that. And then 10% of that money would go into passive savings. So that the 10% goes into what I'd call passive savings. And so it's set aside in some type of an investment account, savings account, those types of things, permanent insurance, something where it's just sitting there. You can get access to it. By the way, need to be able to get access to that money. Okay. It needs to be something you can get to. So don't lock it up. But it is savings, for a rainy day, so to speak. So then I've hit down this financial advisor rule, right? 90-10 in that case. But now I'm at 70-10. So now what do you do with the other 20%? Well, 10% of that, 10% of that should be going to what we call active accounts. And these are capital investment accounts. So I would take 10% of whatever that number is, and I'd be putting this away into an active account. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that money should be going to a business that you want to buy, reinvesting in your own business should be going back into. Now this is really talking about personal money. Now we can talk about the business money too, but I want you to think about this. And by the way, you can do a lot of this with the business, but let's stay on the personal side for a minute. That 10% might go into real estate investment. It might be going into, so you might be funding that, right? Some portion of your income coming from the business is being funded into a real estate account. Call that a capital investment account that's going to go buy a piece of real estate for the practice to be in. It might buy a piece of investment real estate. It might buy a business outside of dental. It is there for you to be active in your pursuits, active money, not passive. And I want you to write this down. All assets have to be managed. All assets. So when people think about businesses or real estate or, oh my gosh, I've got to manage that. Well, all assets have to be managed, and you can pay a property manager, certainly, if you wanted to. You can manage it yourself. Stock portfolio, you can do the same thing. And you can do the same thing with a dental practice if you think about it, right? I could technically put in management. There's not one of you listening to this that I couldn't go back and go to your business and go put active management in place, and then I could manage it from afar. No matter who you are, like I could take your practice tomorrow and do that. And so you've got to believe you can do that, by the way, which is scalability, which is another conversation. So 70% goes to personal income, 10% goes into passive, 10% goes into active. So where does that last 10% go? Here's the part I want you to get. That 10% grows the 70%. That 10% is what you're going to put into personal development. That means personal development, money you're going to use to grow. And there's a caveat to this. The money I want you to use for growth needs to be attached to what I call the compound effect. And we've talked about it before, but it's this idea that success has to do with the little things you do every day, right? It has to do with compound effects over a period of time, right? Nobody develops lung cancer from one cigarette. But we want to use the positive side of that. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So if 10%, let's say you're taking home $100,000 after tax income, and $10,000 goes into personal development, I might put $5,000 of that into personal trainer. Now, here's a question for you. How many of you listening to this put $5,000 into a personal trainer? And heck, what if you did? Now you say, go back to scarcity mindset, that you can't afford it. But here's why I would argue that you can afford it, and why it makes a big difference. Because what happens is, let's assume that you start going to the gym every morning, and you start going to the gym and you start feeling better. And as you start feeling better, right, we don't go eat the bad sandwich. We don't go, right, we don't eat the Egg McMuffin. We don't go do those things, right? We probably go get fruit. We probably go get something healthy, maybe some oatmeal, and then we walk into the office and we feel better, right? We start to feel maybe a little bit more motivated. We're eating better, we're looking better, we probably have more energy. We have more energy, we probably have a better attitude. When we have a better attitude, then we probably are more focused on our work. When we are more focused on our work, then we probably, sort of work starts to going better, and your revenues go up, and you start probably focusing on your marriage and your relationships with your kids, and it has this compound effect. And imagine 10 years of doing that, right? You become an entire different person, and see, that grows the 70%. See, part of the reason we have an epidemic of underperformance is because of the fact that people don't invest in themselves. I will tell you for a fact that I've, in the last 12 months, invested over $100,000 in personal development. Over $100,000 in personal development. And so you've got to think about that for a minute and say, gosh, Eric's putting $100,000. I'm not even putting $2,000. How much money are you putting into your own personal development? So I want you to think about that for a minute, because we start to think about this epidemic of underperformance, and we start to say, look, this 70-30 rule is so important. And it's so important because I want you to think about this for a second. It would have a compound effect, because what would happen is you start feeling amazing, you start looking amazing, you start focusing on your business, you've got money saved up in passive savings, you got money set aside for a building, you got money, and it starts to have this compound effect, and you start feeling better, and you start looking better, and so what ends up happening, it starts beginning wealth, it starts creating more and more places you want to keep expanding this. And so, by the way, I work with people when I do. I don't do a lot of one-on-ones, but when I do, one of the things that we'll do, our coaching team will do, but one of the things we do is when we lay out a financial plan, we look at all this stuff. That's why we look at people's businesses, and we lay out all, what they're doing, and we lay out, what their goals are and where they want to be at, and laying exactly where the assets need to go. Because of that 70%, we've got a lot of work to do there too. And where does that 70% go? So what ends up happening is this idea of wealth is about allocation. It's about allocation. Wealth is about allocation. not income. It's about knowing where to put your money. And so it's such an important thing to know where to put your money, how to put your money. And I've told this story before to people, but one of the wealthiest couples I ever met, wealthiest couples, they were literally worth tens of millions of dollars and never made more than $30,000 of income in their entire, like literally never more than $30,000 individually in their entire adult lives. Husband, wife, gosh, their marriage was amazing. Their attitudes were amazing, and they knew how to allocate money. Do you know how to allocate money? See, I think one of the biggest problems is people are coming after you and they're trying to get you to buy this and buy that and allocate, the investment advisor doesn't look at your business and doesn't look at real estate and really is just trying to put your money locked up away in some qualified fund somewhere oftentimes. Not all of them, but oftentimes. And then we start to go, well then, where am I allocating my money? Even personally, where do I allocate my money? How do I become really, really, really wealthy? And it's learning how to allocate your money properly. But I will tell you this, and you've got to have money set aside for growing businesses, growing real estate. You have to have money aside for savings. And you have to have money aside that's going into personal development. And I'm not just talking about taking some CE courses, okay? I think that's great. I think you should as a doctor, but that's really more on the business side anyhow. I'm saying of what you take home personally. Now, technically, I get that it's all your money, but I'm saying when that $10,000 hits the bank account, then I would say that $1,000 of that needs to be going into some type of personal development. And imagine if you treated your finances this way. And imagine if you invested that $1,000 a month into your marriage, that $1,000 a month into your health, that $1,000 a month into your fitness, that $1,000 a month into your education and learning how to invest. And what would happen over a decade of that? See, when people come to me, what they do is they tell me what they want. I always ask people, what do you want? What is it you want? And when people tell me, first of all, I usually make people think bigger than they ever thought. But then it's going from there and it's saying, okay, now I'm going to show you where to allocate all this money and where to put it. Or our advisory team is going to show people where to put the money. It's why we invest in capital and get really good within the business, because here's what you need to understand. If you can learn how to do this personally, and then we moved this over to the business and we did the exact same thing in the business, and I showed you how to allocate money in the business. Can you imagine what would happen after 5 years, 10 years, what you would look like physically, what your marriage would look like, what your relationships would look like, what your team would look like, what your real estate holdings would look like? Do you know where to allocate capital? So we have this epidemic of underperformance because of the fact that we don't know how to allocate capital. I'm telling you. And because people don't think big enough. If you're only willing to save or put aside or invest 10% of everything you make, then I'm telling you, you need to think bigger. You need to think, how do I make more 70%? What if your 70% went from $100,000 to $200,000 to $500,000 to $1 million? See, that would make you think differently about that 70%, but I would need to allocate that other 30% pretty quickly, or it will get spent on vacations and cars. So here's what I want you to think about today. When it comes to creating wealth, are you underthinking? Right? Are you underperforming compared to your potential? Are you okay settling? Or do you want to build more? Do you want to leave more? Do you want to impact more? Do you want to create so much more? And if you want to do that, the key to this is learning where to allocate. Thanks for listening. Hope you guys have a great week.